Hi, my name is Maria, and this is my channel, Tea Books Magic, and today I'm here to talk about Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings and the kind of unconventional reading order that I chose to get into this massive world of many different series, and whether or not I recommend going the route that I did, or if there's a better way to get started on this general universe. Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings is a, like I said, kind of just big fantasy universe. It consists of 5 different series and 16 books in total. I'm going to insert a kind of little image here of the series so you can kind of see the broad encompassing that this world has. They're broken up into, like I said, those 5 different series that do have beginning and then conclusions, but at the same time they intertwine into the other series, and like characters you'll meet in one series will show up in another, so it is an interconnected world despite having these kind of separate points, if that makes sense. If you're hoping to get started on reading Robin Hobb and specifically this universe, she does have other things she's written outside of this, then there are really arguably like 2 starting points that you could take. The first is the most common starting point for most readers, and that is the Farseer trilogy, starting with Assassin's Apprentice. Book 2 is Royal Assassin, and then book 3 is Assassin's Quest. This trilogy follows Fitz's chivalry Farseer, who is a bastard of the royal bloodline, and it's this big scandal. So his father gives up his right to the throne and goes off into like self-imposed exile, and Fitz is brought to the castle so that they can kind of both keep an eye on this potential threat and also put him to use for the royal family by training him up to be an assassin. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of starting here in just a little bit, but the other starting point that you could potentially take, and the one that I ended up doing, again, kind of the unconventional path, is the Liveship Traders trilogy, starting with Ship of Magic. Book 2 is Mad Ship, and book 3 is Ship of Destiny. And this series follows completely different characters in a completely different section of this overall universe. And the plot starts off in this book with a specific family that owns a wizard wood ship, and wizard wood is essentially a magical type of wood that has these properties where after 3 generations of a family die on board of its ship, it actually quickens or comes alive, and it becomes kind of a talking, sentient ship that is obviously much more valuable than just your basic ship. And at the beginning of this book, this family is facing some financial issues, so that brings into question kind of who the ship will be handed down to in the family, and that causes a lot of tension, and the story takes off from there. Popping this kind of map or reading order of Robin Hobb back up on the screen, basically you'll see that Farseer, starting with Assassin's Apprentice, is the first trilogy, and again, publication order, that's usually where most people start, and then the Liveship Traders, starting with Ship of Magic, is the second trilogy, actually, in terms of publication after Farseer. As I mentioned earlier, Liveship Traders is completely separate in terms of location and characters from Farseer trilogy, and it is the only other possible entry point into this Realm of the Elderlings, because where the third series, the Tawny Man trilogy, picks up, it both references characters and plot points from both the first Farseer trilogy with Fitz and all of the events that happen to him, and then also with the Liveship Traders and all the events that happen in this series. So with the third one, you can't really just jump straight in there. You won't understand a lot, and you will have missed out on a lot of other things. Whereas these other 2 series are ones where you could start in either one, and technically they are the starts of new stories, and you wouldn't need anything else for context. Both of these series do have full and complete arcs, so you could read them as standalone series as well, potentially, if that's what you were looking to do, and you would receive a ending for the story within them. I would argue that the ending and the way that the Liveship Traders trilogy wraps up is less satisfying. Like, you can see at the end of that there are a lot of threads that still need to be picked up on and delved into more in future installments, but there is an overall kind of ending for what we were following along with. Whereas the Farseer trilogy had an ending where I almost felt like I could have seen that this had been maybe her plan to just have this series at first. It felt pretty final, and it felt like it covered and wrapped up a lot of things. The other thing that I should mention before we go into kind of my reasons for why I chose to start unconventionally on the second series is that there are no spoilers if you go straight into Farseer. This is the first starting point. Like I said, publication order, there are no spoilers. There's nothing before it that precedes it, so there's nothing to be spoiled on. With Liveship Traders and the second series, there is some hints of spoilers to how the first series wraps up. I will say my own experience in a little bit, I didn't really have trouble with that. It was vague enough that I didn't really know the details of how we would end up there, or even how they would solve the problems that they were having in this first series, so for me it wasn't an issue, but there are kind of vague hints to some of the events. And then the other thing is that there is a character from Farseer that does show up in Liveship that is kind of a really nice Easter egg, and that is something that you're not spoiled for if you start with Liveship, but you won't get as much appreciation for it if you do go the way that I did. And I'll kind of go more into, again, my experience and whether or not those things were deterrents for me in just a little bit. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out there to explain why most people do start with the very first series. The Farseer trilogy is a court politics, very political storyline. It is a single first-person POV. We're just following everything through Fitz's eyes. We start with him as a child and kind of follow him through childhood and as he gets older. It is a slower pace. It is very much slice of life and, again, kind of aging with him and living his life with him. It's also told in kind of a looking back perspective where Fitz is older and he's narrating events back to us and kind of commenting on some of them, which is a very kind of specific storytelling device, so I wanted to mention it because I think it works for some people and not for others. And actually some people will actively seek that kind of storytelling device out. And also I would say that this series reads a bit more YA because it does follow Fitz as a child, so even though it's written in Robin Hobb's more adult fantasy kind of writing style, it feels a bit more YA leaning just because of the characters and plot points that we're following. We have a bit more teenage love, we have, again, Fitz's kind of emotional maturity, trying to find himself. Those themes are present in there like they would be in a YA novel, but with adult fantasy writing and kind of darker, more emotional themes. Liveship Traders is multi-POV, third person. It's faster paced than Farseer is, but that's not saying much because Robin Hobb's writing style in general is pretty slow. So when I was reading this and I was like, oh, this is what people describe as faster paced. That's still fairly slow compared to other fantasy authors. She really isn't known for her fast-paced plots, but more for kind of staying with her characters through very slice of life moments. This story is much more expansive, whereas Farseer is more contained to kind of the general court and Fitz's experiences. This one has a bit more of travel and a bit more of seeing different areas of the world and just more expansive in that way. And with all the different POVs as well. And this definitely reads more adult than Farseer does. This has quite a lot of trigger warnings, especially as we go into the second and third books. I would recommend looking at all the trigger warnings, but there are trigger warnings for rape, sexual assault, torture, some gore, so pretty dark trigger warnings. Again, recommend looking at the full list before going into this if you do have triggers. So talking a little bit about kind of why I went the unconventional route and why I started with the Liveship Traders trilogy, because I did do my research beforehand and I had my reasons. I would say that the biggest factor for why I picked up the second trilogy instead of the first and chose to start there is because of the way that people talk about the two different series. The Farseer trilogy is, I believe, pretty widely accepted as one of her weaker trilogies in this realm of the Elderlings because it's said to be very slow. We do follow Fitz as a child in the first book, so a lot of that is spent in the kind of mind of a child. And the third book, Assassin's Quest, is also widely accepted to have a lot of pacing issues. It's very much a travel story, but there's a lot of times when things aren't really happening or the story feels like it's stretched out longer than it should be. So before I had even picked these up, I had heard a lot of people complain about this series just being overall slower and kind of reads that you almost have to push yourself through to get to the next series. And also just that the overall quality kind of once people have read through the different series, comparatively, they do rank it lower, typically speaking. Just from what I've seen, but from what I've seen, that tends to be the case. So already when I was looking into this and I was kind of researching where to start, I wasn't really that hyped about getting to this slower, kind of weaker series in order to then carry on into the other series. And on the opposite side of that, the way that people talk about Liveship Traders is this tends to be a lot of people's absolute favorite series in the entire realm of the Elderlings universe. People rave about it. A lot of them give these books 5 stars. This is a series that people tend to agree on being very strong and very memorable and very just unique and kind of, again, one of the favorites and standouts out of the entire universe. So already there's just more hype around it and there's just more excitement going into it, or at least there was for me when I was researching kind of where to start. And I'm just the kind of reader where I have a really hard time forcing myself through books that I don't like. I find it really difficult to stay engaged. I'm very much a mood reader, and so it will just usually put me in a slump. And that's hard enough if it's one book that you have to push yourself through, but when it's an entire trilogy, I was just not optimistic that I would be able to even get to the good stuff with Robin Hobb, and I didn't want to kind of shoot myself in the foot, so to say, by starting with a series that I had thought would not work for me. That was honestly the biggest reason that I chose to start with Liveship. And the other reason was also just that the plot of it had intrigued me a bit more than Farseer, but I think that's just because of the way people talk about it, typically speaking. I feel like it's also an important disclaimer to say that I am also not a big spoilers person. Like, I don't actively seek out spoilers most of the time unless I need encouragement to get through a book that I'm not enjoying and I want to see if it's going to go in a direction that I'm going to like. Most of the time I try not to seek out spoilers, but like with TV shows, for example, I watch out of order sometimes. I kind of will start with the season or when things get good, and then that will give me the motivation to go back and then fill in the backstory. It's awful. My family and my friends don't understand this, so I know it's not a normal thing to do really, or not something that most people do, but I do watch out of order. I kind of don't really care that much about spoilers if it's not big spoilers. If it's little things, I don't need the shock of that item to interest me in reading. I actually am more interested in how we get there, so I can still enjoy a book even after having been spoiled. I don't, again, actively seek out big spoilers, so I wouldn't have read the third or the fourth or the fifth series in this universe, but because I had been told that the kind of stuff that Liveship touches on is very vague, spoilery, and like almost like Easter egg spoilers more than it is big stuff, things that just like I maybe would have appreciated more if I'd gone with the first series, that to me was like, well, that's not a big enough reason for me not to pick up the second one. And I stand by that. I don't think that I really spoiled too much for myself by going into it the way that I did. So now that I've talked about kind of where the two starting points are and why I chose the unconventional route that I did, I want to talk a bit about whether or not I actually recommend it in hindsight, looking back and having read both of these series. Do I think that the way that I went in worked for me, or do I think it actually had its cons? And I think it had both. I should mention that I have been struggling with Hobb in general a bit. Her writing style just hasn't been fully clicking with me. I've enjoyed her stuff on a general level, but I haven't loved anything. And then there's been both conclusions of both series have not worked for me, and I've actually actively not enjoyed them. And one of the things that I was told is that potentially my experience of these series could be affected by the fact that I did read the second one and then the first series, especially with Farseer and how much of a slog the third Assassin's Quest book was. I've been told that me reading them in the order that I did might have emphasized the weak points of Farseer more because of how much better the Liveship Trader is agreed to be in terms of just writing. So I did read the stronger series and then go to the weaker one. I think that regardless, I would have had very negative feelings toward Assassin's Quest, the third, the finale of Farseer, but that is something that I can't know for sure because I did it one way and I don't know how it would have felt if I had done the other. I never did it that way, so I can't know for sure, but I have a feeling I still would have struggled with that finale regardless, but it might have emphasized it more. Just wanted to drop that in there for full kind of transparency. And the other thing that I do want to mention is that what I didn't realize, because when people talk about the books, they kind of hold them up in a way like this, so you don't see the size of the books, but what no one talked about is that this book is almost 900 pages, the very first book of Liveship Traders Ship of Magic, and they are all about as big as this in this trilogy, whereas the Assassin's Quest book is a lot smaller. This is under 400 pages. So under 400, almost 900, they're pretty different size-wise. So when you're deciding whether or not you want to commit yourself to a book by an author that you're kind of trying out, that's something I didn't take into consideration, is that Assassin's Apprentice would just have taken me a lot less time to try out, whereas Ship of Magic was just a really, really thick book, and just a pretty chunky series in general. Pacing-wise, everyone says that Liveship Traders is much more fast-paced than Farseer, but again, that's not saying much because Robin Hobb in general is a pretty slow-paced writer, so even though it is more action-y and there is more stuff happening in Liveship, I would say, it doesn't feel fast-paced. It's still pretty slow-paced and kind of taking your time with things, so don't go in expecting it to be a fast ride. It definitely wasn't that, but I was engaged and kind of interested in the plot, whereas Farseer probably had more kind of just duller moments and kind of downtime, if that makes sense, like more travel or more just hanging out and living your life. Liveship tended to be stuff that was actively happening. The characters weren't really resting at any point. For overall quality, I do agree with most opinions that I've heard that Liveship Traders is stronger than Farseer, and I would argue far stronger than Farseer, so there is that. Again, whether or not it's better to read the weaker series and then the stronger series, or to start off strong and then once you're invested in that world go back and kind of read the first, is arguable, but I would agree that Liveship Traders is a stronger, more memorable series. It's much more unique in terms of plot. It's got a lot more fantasy elements. If you're really a reader who is a world-driven reader who really likes unique kind of magics, Liveship Traders is much more of that. It has that wizard wood and just has a lot of really interesting reveals and kind of threads about the world and the magic. Then Farseer again is much more your classic political storyline. It does have 2 magic systems within Farseer, but they're not necessarily as unique. They're kind of, one is talking to animals, and then the other one is being able to communicate by minds, essentially. Liveship, much more unique and definitely, in my opinion, stronger of the 2 series. So there is that. Just briefly touching on the conclusions of both series, I mentioned that I struggled with both conclusions. I struggled with Farseer's conclusion much more, and it just was more of a slog. It was just a very kind of, I found it really boring travel story, and it lost my interest a lot. I found myself unengaged for a big portion of it. Whereas the conclusion of Liveship Traders, Ship of Destiny, I was not unengaged, but I did not like necessarily some of the choices that were made. So it was a different experience of the conclusions. One, I just found boring and kind of a slog to get through. The other one, I did find really well written and engaging, but I just didn't like some of the choices, and I thought that some of the character decisions that were made did quite feel authentic. So when I say that I struggled with both conclusions, it was for different reasons. And kind of to wrap up, the final question is, do I think that I made the right choice, and do I recommend it to anyone else? The answer is kind of complicated because, yes, I think that the way that I went about it worked for me, because having read Farseer, I now know for sure that I would not have continued on with Robin Hobb. That's a personal opinion though, because I really didn't connect with and didn't enjoy that 3rd book. And so for me, I know that that would have turned me off of continuing on if I had read in the normal order. A lot of people didn't have the same experience with the Farseer trilogy, and again, I have been told that it might have been overemphasized of how weak that 3rd book was because I'd read something stronger by her first. I don't think that played as big of a factor as it could have, but technically, again, that my opinion could be different than someone else's for that reason. But I just know, because of kind of how I felt leaving off of Farseer, I wasn't that excited to continue on. I know that if I had been reading it in that order, that's where I would have DNF'd Robin Hobb in general. Whereas because Liveship Traders, although I didn't really love it as much, I was expecting it to be an all-time favorite series, and it isn't quite there. It did leave a big mark on me, and I do think it was a very unique series. It's one that I am going to be, highly recommending in general, and one that I do think back on a lot in terms of just, again, the uniqueness and the world that she created within it. That one did pique my interest enough for me to now want to continue on with Robin Hobb, and it shows me the potential of where her stories could go. So just because of that alone, reading it the way that I did saved me from not wanting to continue on with Robin Hobb. So for me, it was absolutely hands down the right decision. But do I recommend that choice to other people? The answer would be no, unless you're really only looking to just read one series by Robin Hobb. If you're just looking for a standalone series, absolutely just read Liveship Traders. It is the stronger, more memorable, more unique series of the 2. I don't think reading Farseer on its own as a trilogy is really worth it, in my opinion. Liveship Traders definitely is. If you are, however, looking to get into Robin Hobb and read her entire Realm of the Elderlings and want to kind of make your way through this whole universe and follow this intertwining storyline, you probably should just start with publication order and Farseer, because you're going to have to go back to it anyway in order to continue on to Tawny Man. And I do think that the vague broad stroke spoilers could be bigger issues for other people if you want to go in completely blind. I think even just the hints of what happened could potentially affect other people's reading experiences. And also the Easter egg character that appears in Liveship Traders is a really big deal to a lot of readers, and it's fun to kind of discover that. So because, again, you would have to go back anyway, you might as well experience that in the right way. The only other thing that, again, and I kind of already talked about to consider would be if you really don't like political plots and want more magic and you want something to really hook you into the world, or if you're really worried that you, like me, would have a hard time getting through a kind of weaker series to get onto stronger ones, those are the things that I would consider. But overall, I do think publication makes the most sense if you're trying to read through the entire Realm of the Elderlings. For me, I have no regrets, because I think that, again, I would have just DNF'd Robin Hobb after Assassin's Quest, and thankfully I'm not. I'm going to be continuing on with my buddy read with Kristen from Kristen is Fully Booked. Will I read the entire Realm of the Elderlings remains to be seen. Depends on kind of how I feel about the other series, but because of the way that I did it, it actually did work out for me. I hope this discussion was helpful. I didn't plan to go into this with a definitive answer, because I do think that although most people should read in publication order, my experience is different, and again, just goes to show that the way that I did it worked for me. So maybe this will touch on some points that other people will say, like, oh, actually, that does sound like that would be the way for me to go as well. Just wanted to kind of raise up my different experience from most other readers and just bring up a discussion about it. If you found this helpful, please let me know down below if you read either of these series, or if you have thoughts on kind of the reading order that you chose, or if you're excited to read some of these series or Robin Hobb in general, please let me know as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video.